I think we're going to get started. Thank you very much for joining us. We are here for the session on climate change and homelessness. We're going to play a little bit of musical chairs to make sure that everybody can hear us. Can we just double check and make sure that the virtual audience can hear us? And I want to welcome our virtual presenters, Dr. Sean Kidd, as well as Evlonodo Cooper. Thank you very much for joining. I'm seeing yeses in the chat, so I'm going to assume that means you can hear us. Thank you very much for coming. So, there are very few issues that are going to drive anxiety as much as the intersection between the homelessness crisis and the climate change crisis. So these are very intense, raw subjects. And I want to be clear that, we understand the weight and the gravity and the urgency of this issue. So we're going to be looking at it from a few different angles. In just a moment, I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves. But I first want to, point out a couple of things. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm the one who does that. All right, let me play from the beginning. So we're going to talk about climate change, as I said, from a few different angles. I also know that there are people in the audience who have things to say about this as well. But first, I just want to talk about how climate change affects housing. I mean, it does it in a number of different ways. One, by the effect on the availability of housing. Floods, wildfires, hurricanes and tornadoes are literally destroying housing, displacing people, and there are not units to rehouse them. So the availability of housing is dependent on climate change, or is related to the crisis of climate change, and that it affects housing availability. We are going to hear from Patton about the ability to receive any sort of relief in order to support rehousing. But the reality is, and I think it's not a surprise to us, there's not enough housing for people who need it now. There certainly isn't enough housing for people who are displaced when a disaster strikes. And it's not just housing. It's also job loss. For example, the shrimpers that lost their jobs when Fort Myers Beach was absolutely devastated by the hurricane. Now, this is the backdrop against which we are going to be discussing the issues. And there's one thing I just want to point out, and I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Tristia Bauman. I'm a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center, and my work really focuses on criminalization of homelessness. And there's a connection between housing systems and how we address climate change, but there's also a connection as it relates to criminalization of homelessness. It leaves people more vulnerable. They're pushed into more dangerous spaces, including spaces that are more prone to the negative effects of climate change. For example, when people are pushed out of streets, they may go into locations like woods that are more vulnerable to fires. These are matters of life and death. And it's important for us to keep that in mind and to recognize the intersectionality of the issues that we're working on as we talk about an issue that is, at the forefront of a lot of our minds, and especially, here in this room as we think about homelessness. I'm going to stop and we'll start our musical chairs process because we have a wonderful panel, and I'd like to give everyone, a chance to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with our virtual panelists. So that they can give, kind of a quick introduction, who you are. We're going to go through later and have everyone give a presentation, and we'll have some time for discussion. But if we can start with quick introductions, and first I'd go to Dr. Kidd.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Hopefully I'm coming.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't hear you.
I'm not sure. My mic is showing that I'm live.
And it's not you, it's me. Should I join computer audio?
No, it should be coming. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Hear him.
Yeah, we had this before.
Oh, okay.
Let's try this and see if that.
Oh, actually, here
Okay.
it is.
Coming
I
through?
got it.
Am I coming through now?
Yes.
Oh, great. There we go.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me on here. It's a pleasure. Just briefly, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm a senior scientist and the division chief of psychology at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, which is a large academic health sciences center in Canada. And my background Hasn't been for most of my career climate change. It's a relatively latecomer in terms of topics I've focused on. I've done quite a bit of work in the area of youth homelessness and developing and trialing interventions for young people. And more recently in the last few years, I've done global health work in the area of climate change, health equity, and the intersection of housing and homelessness. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd. And next up, a good friend, a great man, Evlonodo Cooper.
Hello, everyone. My name is Evlonodo Cooper. I write about climate change and energy for Media Matters for America. I've been writing about climate for about 6 or 7 years now, but I come to this issue on a very personal level. I was living in New Orleans, Louisiana when Katrina hit, and so I know very well firsthand how hard it is to recover after a devastating storm that basically eradicates your life. And I'm thankful to be on the panel, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evlonodo. All right, and now the musical chairs. I'm going to move out of the way so that you can hear from our great in-person panelists, and I'll have them introduce themselves as well. Antonia, would you mind scooting over there? And I'm going to scoot over to the side as well. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Denise. She, her are my pronouns. And I work at Community Justice Project in Miami. I'm a staff attorney there.
Hey everybody, Noah Patton, Housing Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery at the National Low Income Housing Coalition.
All right, can folks hear me in the virtual audience? All right, great. So we're going to start with Dr. Sean Kidd, who will give us some perspective. And Dr. Kidd, I'd love for you to first give us, an overview. What are we talking about when we're referring to climate change and homelessness, and in particular, what is the impact of climate change on global homelessness in the social science?
For sure. Yeah, happy to cover this, and I'll cover it at a fairly general or high level. I'm looking forward to questions and conversation as we move along. So I came to this work, like I mentioned, a bit of a latecomer, of course, having done quite a bit of work with people experiencing homelessness. I've spent a lot of time with folks suffering in different ways in exposed situations, and seeing our fairly inadequate responses here in Canada, and similar in most places where we have warming and cooling centers and giving out water bottles and these kinds of things, which are helpful, but certainly not a solution. So that led me to move in the direction of trying to look at what the literature is out there, and there's not a lot, as well as, and maybe more importantly, engaging an international group of experts in this area from various places in the world who have an interest in homelessness and climate change. And we had many think tanks, as well as looking to literature to try and break out what are the key issues and responses that we should be thinking about. And I'll just cover those briefly. So roughly speaking, the implications of climate change for homelessness break out into two themes. One is climate-driven migration. Now, there's a fair bit of discussion about climate-driven migration, but where there's less, and I think where we have been doing some work, is migrating to what? There's a lot less discussion about the situations people are migrating into, and for many people around the world, that's into various states of housing precarity and outright homelessness. And these challenges, and this is a cross-cutting theme in low and middle income countries around the world, disproportionately bear the brunt of the climate change, climate crisis impacts. And there we see the greatest impacts on migration, though we're certainly not immune to migration here in North America as people lose homes to various crises and weather extremes, and then are themselves migrating. And in the process of migration, generally this is happening to folks whose housing is already not great. It's housing is often in exposed situations, not weather resilient, losing housing, and typically in many jurisdictions around the world, there's not great planning. It tends to be just disaster sorts of scenarios, and people are fleeing as best they can. And disparities mount. You probably all heard of climate change as a threat multiplier, but certainly we see violence from interpersonal to larger levels can erupt. Groups such as women disproportionately and children disproportionately bear the impacts. And you see what, in the homelessness sector, we often will talk about the vicious cycle. You can certainly see that here is for every step away from housing security in these scenarios it gets harder and harder as health and challenges, other exposures compound. And we see in places like Kenya and Nairobi, some of the largest slums in the world with hundreds of thousands of people there, and many are fleeing arid landscapes, flooding, these sorts of things. And in these slums are exposed to, just outright exposed to storms. And we see, for example, the death of children and infants in particular in these situations, and the elderly. And in terms of, so that's the migration theme, and it also intersects, of course, and I've already started touching on this with exposure. Exposure in North America, we're going to be much more familiar with because we see it probably nearly every day in our lives, in our cities, of people lacking housing, being out in exposed circumstances in different ways. And generally exposure takes several shapes. So you've got direct exposure, like we'll be very familiar with heat, for example, and there's something called the heat island effect. And we know in inner cities it's much hotter because of all the concrete, not much shade. So people experiencing homelessness are exposed to heat. And of course, we know that most folks in these situations are also experiencing ongoing health challenges, physical and mental health challenges, malnutrition, and these all make people more vulnerable to the impacts of heat exposure. Less obvious than heat exposure is cold and wet. And people might not think so much about cold and wet exposure with climate change, but we do see variability in impacts and some somewhat surprising findings. Like, for example, illness, morbidity, and mortality tends to be actually associated with milder cold weather, sort of around 0 degrees Celsius. I might need a translator there for you folks in the US, but milder cold and wet circumstances. And these are often situations where the out of the cold shelters and people aren't thinking much about response. Of course, in extreme cold, people are opening their doors more. And as well, if you look at indirect impacts, so air pollution worsens with climate change, and exposure folks to air pollution has all kinds of health impacts. And I'm actually in the middle of writing a review looking at brain development and these kinds of indirect exposures, and some things that are worth thinking about. For example, women who are pregnant and experiencing heat extremes and hyperthermia, this can cause preterm birth, which has impacts not only on maternal health, but also the health of babies and brain development of babies. Exposure to air pollution, same sorts of things. And you can kind of see how these indirect exposures have impacts. And then in terms of the outcomes, and there's really the data, we don't have good data on this. And of course, we tend to have the most data about the folks who need help the least. It's often in low income settings where we have the least reliable data. But we do see rises in illness, morbidity, mortality, but we really just don't understand these complex systems very well. And then heading into responses, and I'll wrap on this because I know I'm at time, but as I mentioned, our responses globally tend to be pretty ad hoc and reactive. Out of the cold shelters, warming centers, cooling centers, giving out water bottles, these kinds of things. The little bit that we do know about what works is when you engage at the community level, you engage in co-design, peer support, these kinds of models, you're more likely to be able to get resources out to people and have people understand the risks involved. I should have mentioned too that these populations are seldom included in disaster planning. And that's another area where there's a need to make sure that in disaster planning, people are asking questions about what happens in these circumstances with people lacking housing. So I'm going to stop there. I know these threads will continue as we do some Q&A and discussion, but thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And before we move on to our next speaker, I do have just a couple of follow-up questions. Can you talk about the state of social science research around climate change and homelessness? Is it robust or is it sparse? It's
very sparse. I mean, it's generally because important data in this area will tend to be sort of population level data. You need large numbers often to understand what these impacts are. And as well, as many folks be aware, unless you have longitudinal data, it's hard to track what impacts are over time. You can look at associations, like there's some studies looking at emergency room admissions in certain weather circumstances or those kinds of things. And that's information that's useful. But by and large, we're really lacking good information. And a key thing here, why this is such an important topic, it's not certainly for just academic interest, is in these complex systems surrounding this, and we don't have much resource to put into solutions. We need to look at points of leverage as where we get the biggest bang for the buck in intervening. It's usually going to be prevention, these kinds of things, and we just don't have the data to understand what are those points of leverage in different parts in the world around different issues. So it's quite complex, and by and large, we're really lacking information.
Of the information we do have, what are some of the points of leverage around prevention? What can we do based on the research we have?
Well, I think outside of the realm of research, I think just the absolute most logical thing is if we don't have people experiencing ongoing homelessness and exposure, we don't have people exposed to climate change and weather extremes. So the coming back to the fundamental priority of reducing homelessness writ large, I think that's a major piece. If we do want to look at prevention, a strategy specifically, one is, for example, around migration, is we can use what we can often predict where storms are going to hit, where weather extremes, what the patterns are. Can we go to places where people experiencing poverty are in exposed circumstances and either help them move in an organized way through community engagement or help them improve their housing so it's more weather resilient? So that's one example. If we're looking at responses, along with just reducing homelessness, like I think a key piece here is not necessarily folks who are street homeless, but people in inadequate housing. Like I saw, for example, in Canada, horrendous death rates among impoverished elderly people in the heat wave, not last summer, but the summer before, hundreds of people dying without air conditioning and without access to services. And we know for these folks, cooling centers don't work. They're not getting out to those places. So how can we organize outreach and how can we improve access to air conditioning and better housing for those folks? So just a few examples of many, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And one last follow-up question regarding, again, just the research that we have now in some context. First, you're in Canada.
Yeah.
So you're in North America. We are practitioners, organizers working here in the United States that has a history characterized by systemic racism, where systemic racism has limited housing choice, adequate housing options, and you see grossly disproportionate rates of Black and Brown people in the homeless population. So of the social science research that exists now, how much of it focuses on the acute impacts on Black and Brown communities?
I think it's a topic that hasn't had nearly enough attention. My colleague Ingrid Waldron at Master University in Hamilton is one of the few folks in Canada who's bringing some concentrated attention there. But I think it's nascent, very early. I think we're further down the road in racism and genocide experienced by our Indigenous populations in Canada. And of course, they're also overrepresented in homeless populations, in inadequate housing, unreserved. I think this is a similar situation in the United States too. And along with cultural connections to the land. And so there are not only impacts to health, but impacts to spirituality, culture, and social connection. And so that's a topic that's had some more attention, albeit again, their action is less than sort of interest, I would say. But in the topic of environmental racism for Black and Brown folks, it's a topic here that's just beginning, and people like Ingrid Waldron is trying to increase prominence there.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that's a good segue for our next speaker, Denise, who has done a lot of work on climate gentrification. So, we know that climate change disparately affects people who are housing vulnerable and limits housing choice, including by literally destroying sources of housing, but it also limits housing choice in other ways, including climate gentrification. And I know that you study that in Miami-Dade. So we're going to turn it over to Denise.
Thank you. Is the power on this one?
Oh, yeah, and actually it is. This here. This is something up at the top that would indicate like how to make it full screen. Oh, I think full screen.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Okie doke. I'll probably try to breeze through this because it's kind of long. Sometimes I'm like, time is a fiction. I'm gonna talk, but I'm like, here, we want to skip to the schedule. So okay. What was it? Next or enter to get to the next slide?
I think arrow. Is that working? No.
Yeah.
Down arrow? No.
Back down arrow. Okay. Okay, so first, just a little bit more about Community Justice Project. We're a nonprofit movement lawyering firm that supports grassroots organizing for power and racial justice and human rights with innovative lawyering and creative strategy tools, i.e. like our artists in residence, we work with artists a lot. And generally, my clients are organizers and organizations, so not necessarily individuals. And the whole goal is to support folks that are directly impacted in discovering their power, pushing for change in their communities, and addressing systemic issues, and just really acting as tools to remove barriers for them discovering that path and working along that path. So really not to lead it, not to tell people what to do, not to do any of that, but just to respond to the absolute needs that they say that they need, and just to be there for them along the way. We also use policy tools and arts, and a lot of the times I'm not even litigating. I'm just like kind of in the room trying to be supportive in a way that I can, to be honest. I've drawn a lot of posters. I've made a lot of flyers. I've talked a lot about non-eviction and non-climate gentrification things with people. So really it's quite expansive. So purpose is to grow democratic people power and shrink oppressive power. And this is just a nice quote that we like to throw out there in spaces. Without community, there is no liberation, and something that I think attorneys forget often and generally don't keep at the forefront when we work within community. And this is just an example of some of the campaigns that we've helped on, some of the graphics that we've made to help assist campaigns to help broaden community knowledge around really complicated legal structures that are impacting people's lives, so that they can speak at committee hearings, go to the state capitol, and those things. And we try to translate information in a way that is extremely easy for everyone to understand, so that they can decide how they want to change it. Okay, so climate gentrification. In Miami, we are very close to a lot of water, for anyone who didn't know, and sea level rise is a huge issue. A lot of the most expensive property is around Miami Beach, which is obviously right at sea level, and floods super often. And a lot of the higher level land is inland, in places like Little Haiti, Alipata, Liberty City, Overtown. These are predominantly Black and brown and like heavily immigrant neighborhoods that are at the highest elevation in the county. So over the past however many years, let's say 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in developers buying up properties at these higher elevation lands in Black and brown communities, and sort of leaving the beach, because that is not a smart investment, because literally in 2050, it will not exist. People won't want to buy there. It is just not smart. And so another important factor on this is because of redlining and a bunch of racist housing policies from the past, these Black and brown communities have been forced inland. They were not allowed to buy on the beach and be on the beach and stay there, because that was the beautiful space that everybody rich and whoever wanted to go. And everyone else was forced inland, and now this land is being taken away from them. So here is just a quote from a series of articles and short videos that was created by a Miami native journalist, Jessica Muli, who's also a friend of mine, called The Color of Climate. And if you want to learn more about it, I suggest you can Google Color of Climate. It was from a Roots publication. You can Google it and just find out more about the work that she's done, and find out more about climate gentrification.
I'm going to have you pause 1 second.
Yeah.
You're doing amazing. We're having trouble seeing the slides on the Zoom.
Oh, no.
So I'm going to just have you escape out of there real quick.
Yeah, please.
And let me see if I can fix it for you.
While we do that, let me look for CLE code number 1.
Should be a co-host now. Okay, and I think what we want to do is
Okay, for everyone who's tracking CLE credits, the first code word is relief. Relief.
Full screen? Is that what you used before?
Yeah.
Okay. Can folks online see the slides now?
They
Yes,
can.
okay.
You didn't miss much, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am just, so a lot of the work that I do now, I work with, oh no. Do you want me to pause?
Yeah, if you don't mind,
I didn't.
actually.
Expectations were, the hybrid conference.
Tough.
Okay, so glad folks online can see it. Folks here can no longer see it. I am going to, your choice. If you'd like to continue, I'm going to get a tech person to see if they can fix it.
I mean, how do folks in the room want to continue, or do you want to see, I mean, the slide? Yeah, there you go. Okay, I will continue.
I love
Thank
it.
you.
Okay.
Okay, so a lot of my work right now, I do a lot of individual rep for folks that are facing eviction, and a lot of the times, there's always conditions issues. So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is also trying to address just the widespread mass disinvestment in a lot of these communities that manifest in terrible conditions issues for folks, especially while it's flooding. I've had clients that we've needed to like help get hotel rooms because they were afraid to be in their home when storms were coming, right? And they're just terrified to stay in those conditions while there's like an active eviction case going on because they're not paying their rent, yet they literally are scared to be under the roof. And so there are, I think in Miami, many different ways of that climate justice and housing kind of intertwine. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the fights that we've assisted with in Little Haiti. Little Haiti, like I mentioned before, is at some of the highest elevation land in Miami. And over the past 7-8 years, there's been a mass of mega developments that have been proposed to be put up in Miami. There are two in particular that I'm going to talk about. One is Magic City and the other is Eastside Bridge. So I have this little map here. I don't know if y'all, I'm just going to turn this around a little bit just to try to show. This is just some portion of Miami-Dade County, and all of these red dots over here, they have different names on them. You can't see them, but these are different, like basically like mega developments that have been proposed within the past 10 years in some of these communities. Oh, this is a touchscreen computer, y'all. So all that touching. So these are different mega developments that have been proposed over the years, and they are proposed through a sort of tool or mechanism in the Miami zoning code, which is called Miami 21, called the Special Area Plan. Special Area Plan is basically a way for developers to submit an application and just get massive bonuses in density and switch the underlying land use map and the zoning code from residential restricted to like open commercial. And so you have communities that used to be just like 5-story residential buildings, and you're building like 5 different buildings, 25 stories each, commercials, hotels, parking lots, like just massive. And it doesn't fit the character of the community. It raises property prices, people get kicked out. And it's supposed to be a way to sort of like drum up development, that the city of Miami added this tool to their code like 10 years ago. And it was supposed to just help with thoroughfare and help, move development a little bit more quickly. But obviously when you give people an inch, they take a mile, and developers in the community found a way to just make a lot of money off of the community. So that's what they've been doing. So Magic City was one of these SAPs. I just have a little bit in this slide, just a little bit of information about Magic City. which is like in the middle of Little Haiti, which is predominantly residential, like I said, low income. And they were going to build this 165,000 square foot civic space with 263 residential units, about 2 million square feet of office space, 500,000 square feet of commercial space, 200 square feet of hotel space, 120 square feet of exposition space, 6,000 parking spaces, 20 to 25 story buildings. There's about 5 or 6 of them, 10 liquor licenses for just that complex, and a completely enclosed park that's a tree-lined promenade for the low-income Little Haiti community. What was that? I think so. Not it just being the button.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yes. For y'all online, it was one button. There was literally a button right in front of us. Okie doke. Okay. So this is, and Magic City was approved at the city commission level in 2018. Magic City was approved by the Planning, Zoning, and Appeals Board, and then it went up to the City Commission and was approved at the City Commission level. Throughout, the years that it was being approved, we worked with the Family Action Network movement in Little Haiti, which is an organizing and service group in Little Haiti, and they actively fought against this development being approved. They would bring people to every single meeting. They had public comment. They ran campaigns. They told commissioners. They met separately with commissioners. They did everything they could have done to say that this is not good for us. This is not what we want. And all along, the developers like, no, it's going to be good. We're gonna, we're gonna put Haitian art in the lobbies. Like, it's gonna be great. There's no affordable housing. Their only community benefit was that they were going to pay for the park to be maintained. So the city didn't have to pay for the park to be maintained. Like, that was their community benefit. It ended up being approved. We ended up appealing it. Appealing the approval because we tried to intervene on behalf of a resident who was renting, who lived about a block away, and the city commissioner mentioned that because this person was a renter, he did not believe that he had any rights to say that he was disproportionately impacted, because only owners would be disproportionately impacted. But this man had been living in this unit for 20 years, and he was a renter, and we ended up losing the appeal for a lot of different reasons, and even though that ridiculous statement was made. So Magic City is going to be going up in Little Haiti. So if you ever visit Miami soon and you see that, don't go. But also know that there were small business owners and families and people that lived in the space that this is going to go. There actually used to be a mobile home park that was there a long time ago that we defended people, and the mobile home park was kicked out, and then the land was vacant for a while, and then they came with Magic City. So this is a kind of a lost fight at this point, and it's really sad. But also moving forward, after Magic City happened, there was a proposal from community groups. Oh, I don't know how to disappear this. Disappear. Can I move it? I'm not even gonna try. The technical is retrograde right now. There was a community campaign to abolish the special area plans. It was unsuccessful, but this was just some of the tactics that the community was using to try to stop these mega developments from going up. That mentioned the fact also that they're being taken advantage of. Once the Black communities are being taken advantage of, once again, they were prevented from living at the beach back when their communities were being formed because of racist policies. And now that they formed their communities and they've lived here because of climate gentrification, they're being kicked out once again.
Mm-hmm. Just hit stop share.
Stop share. Will that stop the entire share? Yeah. I think that will stop everything from being shared.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I was just okay. They don't. It was just this one side.
You can move it down to the bottom.
Yeah, I think because I don't. The touchpad is. I'm a Macker, and so I'm a little scared to click things on this. So we lost Magic City. At the same time Magic City was happening, there was another proposal for another development, again, in Little Haiti, residential community, literally 2 or 3 blocks away, called Eastside Ridge, that was going to be even bigger than Magic City. And this time they were proposing to literally move a whole apartment complex of people out of their homes. Yes, so they were proposing, as you can see on the screen now, all basically similar to Magic City. It's going to be parties, it's going to be restaurants, it's going to be, you know, luxury apartments, it's going to be, shopping, it's going to be all the things, right? That's what they were proposing. The community got involved and this is just an example of I also took some of these slides from when we would hold community meetings after other community meetings to try to tell the community sort of how the developers are just being completely unresponsive and to like band together to like make some demands for things. But the community came and started asking questions about what they would be getting in exchange for this building coming. And you could see some of the really super lackluster responses that were given back to them. So these are some of the communities, what the community felt were development failures, that design place residents were going to receive no reallocation assistance. So they were literally proposing to help people with moving costs, to move them out of units, and then possibly move them back into a new unit in this new building, but only for 1 year and at not their same rental price. So most people would not be able to afford to get back in. And I guess, where are we now? Yeah, that was the last thing. And I mentioned these two fights, and right now with East Side Ridge, the community was able to get a group of demands together that they presented to the commissioner in the district. And that commissioner sort of held strong that some affordable housing needed to go into the development. And literally the developers kind of have just stopped. It could still come back up for like 6 or 7 months now. They've been very unresponsive because I think we got one commissioner on our side who is the commissioner for that district. So there's 2 other commissioners that then got on her side because they were like, well, it's your district, so we'll go with what you say. And she was like, if there's going to be no affordable housing, I'm going to deny this development. Like, it will not pass in commission. And so literally for months now, almost a year, the developers been arguing with themselves because they do not want to put any affordable housing in this massive development in the community, literally 2 blocks away from where another massive development was going on. So a lot of this, and that's like where we are now, it's like kind of solid. So maybe we've won on the East Side Ridge fight here, but it's all because of community input, it's because of community work, and it's because of people getting together and getting really knowledgeable on what has been going on and sort of what developers don't think that they're sophisticated enough to talk about or to come and say and to stand up for their community. And that's, I guess I'll stop there. I'm like rambling a little bit now. But that is some of our fights. That's some of what we've been doing. And yeah, I'll turn it over.
That's great, Denise. I have a few follow-up questions for you. I mean, you mentioned that the Magic City project and the organizing around it was great, but that the outcome that you were hoping for, wasn't achieved. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you could point to as a difference in the strategy between combating the East Side project versus the Magic City project.
Yeah, I think strategy sort of remains the same. Get commissioners on your side, do a lot of base building, do a lot of nitpicking at development agreements and adhering to zoning rules and regulation. But I think really the changing factor that made it a lot more successful, to be honest, in the East Side Ridge debate is that the community groups that were involved, that were going to be directly impacted, they came together and they agreed on a group of demands that none of them varied from. And there were multiple community groups that grew power. And I think that there was disagreements internally a lot, but externally to the commissioners and to everybody, it's like, this is what we agree on. This is what we want. And everybody was able to say consistently the same thing. I think that in Magic City, the commissioners sometimes felt left. They were like off the hook when there were multiple community groups saying that they wanted different things and you couldn't get everything, So they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just make the best decision that I have to make, which is obviously a decision that's best for them and not for the community at all, which is what happened. And they ended up giving like no money into like a housing fund that is not being used for anything to do with housing in Little Haiti at all, as like a community, as like one of the community benefits from some of these other things. So I think that the deciding factor here was really the community working together and being like super consistent on what they wanted and working really hard to come up with a list of demands that they all agreed upon.
Yeah, a couple questions from the audience, Lily.
I'm curious how you got community together. Was it from Little Haiti? issues and then it transferred over, they did the secrets, like, that's to get like the leadership.
Yeah.
I think what you're describing is what we really often with gentrification, right?
Yeah, can you repeat the question just for the virtual audience? Because I'm sure they couldn't hear Lenny.
Yeah, I think the question was, how did the community groups like come together and how did they stick together? So a lot of this, and to be clear, like a lot of this was led by the Family Action Network movement and some other groups there, especially La. That's in Little Haiti in Miami as well. And I think FAM Family Action Network Movement is what we call FAM. FAM did a lot of work in order to bring a lot of those community groups together. They are a massive service provider in Little Haiti. So it's also, there's name recognition when it comes to them. When FAM's like, can you come to the table? Can you come and talk with us? And also La is like a huge service provider as well. So I think getting those sort of like big names into the room and bringing other people. And then, you know, there's tensions. Magic City did not win. And I think Magic City did not win because there were a lot of people on a lot of different pages and a lot of people were upset about that. So I think like, especially when you're working in community, like big emotions, big passionate emotions, people being angry with each other is not like something new, you know, like people, it's tough and it's hard and people have different opinions about how to win. Even if you want to win, what winning looks like is different for people that are from the same place, that are fighting for the same things sometimes. And I think that commissioners and folks on the opposite end that might want something different use that to their advantage and they pit you against each other often. So I think it's like getting smart about what the other side is trying to do and like really trying to work on these internal battles and what we can agree on and what we mean when we say win and what do we get from it and how we're holding people accountable. And I think that after Magic City, there were a lot of big lessons that were learned that allowed people to stay united at all costs during Eastside Bridge. And I think like by losing massively and realizing why you lost or that it was bad that you lost or you didn't like the outcome will make you sort of rethink sort of separating yourself or doing something different the second time and make you think about it like a little bit more. So I think that there was definitely lessons learned on how staying united could be more powerful than being divided, even if you're not getting 100% of what you want from the agreement, if the whole community can agree on it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The question.
I can just cover some of the questions that I asked during the pre-planning of the East Side project was that it should have been a needs assessment and whether or not the needs assessment would approve already that what the need was.
Right.
And so that should have been automatically written into that agreement. So it seemed like y'all wasted a whole lot of time with people that didn't know or just didn't care about what the needs assessments were.
Right.
So I think that should have been nipped in the butt in the beginning. Why waste taxpayers' money, waste people's time and you know, bring a whole lot of stress on the community when we have high hopes of when people need housing. So yeah, so you did answer about being more cohesive as a community and stand our ground. We have to teach people to advocate for themselves, stand their ground, and to be a nuisance. So we have to teach people to be a nuisance.
Unapologetically.
Unapologetically in your face all the time.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I agree. And I think that for some of these projects, like what we try to do is find them really early on, but to be 100% honest, a lot of the advocacy that we're trying to do now is to just rewrite the zoning code because a lot of the community input comes. So for these special area plan applications that allow massive bonus, like massive density bonuses, massive changes to the code that allow for a lot of commercial zoning and a lot of just expensive stuff. The application comes, the planning department works with the applicant for months. And then after that's approved there, then it finally comes to the planning board. So when the community finally gets to say something, it feels to them like it's the planning department that's supposed to be neutral and the developer against the community. Because y'all have had like a year to work on this application together to make it so that you like it, but you literally haven't asked any of us if we like it. And there's no requirements that go into that application that have to do with giving us a community benefit. There's no affordable housing requirement. There's no, you know what I mean? And the way that the planning and zoning board is set up, at least in Miami, is that even if the planning and zoning board unanimously denies the proposal, it still moves on to city commission. So yes, and so there's not a lot of power that they have to stall. And then after the Magic City fight, because FAM fought so hard, the city commission passed a new policy saying that no proposal can stay in the planning and zoning board phase for more than 6 months. because Eastside Ridge was in planning and zoning board page for like 4 or 5 years. And so after that, they got so frustrated, they passed a new policy. They're like, no, only 6 months. So if you do not vote, it goes on to city commission after 6 months. If you vote unanimously to deny because it's a bad proposal, it goes on to city commission. And then I mean, if you're thinking about strategy, your strategy changes because the city commission is just a whole different playing field in the planning and zoning board, you know, like what their interests are, like where the district, like, you know, who the districts are, what their association is with the organizations. And so you're just like, it's a terrible place. It's a terrible place. It's so hard. It's just like, it's just downhill like every single time. And we really respect all the folks that organize there and all the clients that I work with in the organizations, because they work really, really hard. And sometimes I'm just like, what can I do to help? I'm so sorry. This is like really bad. I like don't have plans. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
And Lily has another question.
I'm just wondering how much we can get protection around notices for possible
Mhm.
displacement. In California, we have mobile home parks and that helps, right? Instead, that is a time to organize the members that all the residents get together, and we've been able to be successful in big mobile home parks. They've been organized with it. You know, this for apartments or hotels that people are staying on, we don't have that.
Right.
I'm just wondering if that's something we should be advocating for, that early notice provision, notice application.
Yeah, I think the community should be notified once an application is put in, and they should get input immediately. When the planning department finds out, why is the community not finding out? Why is the only point for public comment after it's already been approved by literally everybody at the government level? Like it's an imbalanced playing field. And I think there needs to be more, there needs to be community benefit like packages that are agreed upon just on it as a base level. You can't submit the application unless you've agreed to these community benefits that the community can then come up with, which is like another campaign that some of our other partners are trying to lead to make it so that if there is an SAP that is applied for within certain boundaries, that before they even submit an application, they have to agree to at least some form of affordable housing, at least some form of this, at least some form of that. And I didn't even mention in Eastside Ridge, one of their community benefits was a police station that they were going to lease to the police department, Miami-Dade Police Department, for $1. And that was like $2 million of community benefits. And there was no affordable housing. But like, we're going to police you better. And we're going to give the police officers a free station here to probably protect the completely enclosed park that's public for everybody. Right? Like, no, it's not public for everybody. Like, I'd be scared to walk in there because there's going to be police officers just chilling because that's home base. And now it's completely enclosed. I can't afford to live here. Like, this doesn't look like my community. It's nice inside, but I'm obviously not supposed to be there. And just because you put Haitian heart in the hallway, I'm sorry. Like, I don't feel welcome. I'm so sorry. This is dumb. You're stupid. But it's just how I talk at the city commission meetings. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. I'm not kidding, actually. But yeah, no, I think there needs to be, I think the earlier you can get agreements, the better. The way I look at it is just like, Miami, why are you not valuing yourself? Like, I think about like, when I'm talking to my friend, I'm just like, y'all come on, you look good, girl. Like, you are valuable. Don't let someone just come in here and not promise you things at the upfront. Like, no, if you want to build here, I'm getting things. And like, believe they're afraid, you know, if we make them do too much at the beginning, they're not going to develop and we're not going to get any of the money. And it's just like, you know what, so long. You know, because you want to be here because this community and a lot of the Black and brown low income communities have created a culture that everybody wants to come and visit. Everybody wants to be here because we are here. And this is what we've done. So now you're just going to sell what we've created for the cheap because you want it and kick us out. And that's how I see it.
Thank you. Right. Well, we will have time for audience questions later, and we are going to move to our next speaker, Noah Patton. Let's make sure. Now, just a quick question to the virtual audience. You can put it in the chat. Are you able to hear the questions that are asked in the audience?
Muffled.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Noah, when we go to any questions, what we experienced last time, just so you know, we do have a microphone, but if we take it away from where the computers are, you're not going to hear it any better. It's going to be muffled as well. So we will try to repeat the question here or maybe we can write kind of a summary of it in the chat when we move to that session.
Sure.
Great, thank you so much. And it looks like you've got everything pulled up. Take it away, Noah.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Noah Patton, Housing Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. In case you don't know, NLIHC is an organization that pushes for racially and socially just policy that ensures households with the lowest incomes can live in affordable and accessible homes in communities of their choice. NLIHC facilitates the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. It's a group of over 890 organizations that work together to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover. And all that is to say that I usually just tell people my job is to yell at FEMA. So, you know, continuing the theme of calling people stupid. So, like,
It's a good thing.
it's a good theme
Or
indeed.
read, like, also yesterday, I think.
So yeah, so through this, we've picked up a lot of information about how FEMA works explicitly when it comes to households with low incomes and people experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to kind of give you a broad overview of how that works and more specifically, how that does not work at all. But first I wanted to just hit some just general terminology points that I think all advocates should know when they're talking about disasters, is that a disaster occurs when a hazard, which is like wind or rain or Godzilla, impacts the built environment, which is the place where we live or work, and overwhelms our emergency services ability to respond to that hazard. So when you say natural disaster, it's a misnomer because disasters aren't natural. A hurricane out in the middle of the ocean isn't a disaster, it's just a hurricane out in the middle of the ocean. So when you say natural disasters, you're kind of implying that it is some sort of like, oh, nothing could have been done about it, or like, oh, it was an act of God. So like you're letting people off the hook. You're letting the policymakers off the hook because it's policy decisions that impact where we live, how we live, the type of housing that we live in, and how we respond to a disaster. So anytime you type out natural disasters, just imagine my head popping up on your shoulder and saying, delete it, just say disasters, shorter anyways. I also just like to point out that it has been documented that human beings as a first reaction to disaster situations are unselfish, inclusive, and non-biased. This fades, of course, as recovery begins and scarce resources and so on and so forth. But I think it's always a hopeful note to put in there that usually when stuff hits the fan, people's first reaction is to help each other, which I think is a good thing to think about because this topic is so depressing. So looking at kind of how the federal government responds to disasters. So this is, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is basically the process. Key thing here is that a state government has to request a federal response. So the feds don't just come in. The feds will come in if a state says, oh, we can't respond to this disaster anymore. Give us some of that sweet federal money. And then the feds will come in. And it goes on and so forth. And that arrow should be much longer based on how long it takes to actually get to the HUD money, but we'll touch on that in a second. Just to touch on homelessness during the response phase of a disaster, just based on what our partners have told us in the past, since I've been working here for 4 years or so. Number one, there's an issue with no access to emergency information. Folks in encampments, folks living on their own, don't get those emergency alerts that we all get that wake us up in the middle of the night or something. And even when they do, there's often not a means of evacuation or a lack of control over the destination of where they're being taken. There's discrimination at emergency shelters. One shelter during Hurricane Michael affixed any person that they identified as experiencing homelessness with a special sticker. So the emergency workers could tell who was experiencing homelessness and who was, a normal disaster survivor. There's also a disruption of the support networks. Soup kitchens can't operate, other closed distribution centers can't operate and that sort of thing. In addition, because FEMA has been placed under the Department of Homeland Security, there's DHS involved, there's police involved, which obviously impacts their, folks' ability to interface with the emergency management system. And of course, there's curfews, which, goes show itself there. And there's an excellent actually study that like blew my butt off that was released. It's from the All Hazard Center at the University of Colorado. It's got risk communication planning, learning from people with lived experiences. And it's just an excellent paper that has people experiencing homelessness themselves talking about what it means to be warned about a disaster, and talking with homeless outreach workers about, like a homeless outreach worker saying, like, I feel like it's useless to be like, hey, heads up, like there's going to be a deep freeze tonight because I don't have anywhere to send them. So it's just kind of saying, hey, you might die, like, have a good one. Like, so it's a thing where we're talking about risk communication, but we're also talking about ensuring that there's access to assistance and safety measures simultaneously. So I'm not gonna go through all of this, but these are the assistance types that FEMA offers. Public assistance is kind of a misnomer. It's assistance to municipalities, to state governments, and specifically reimbursement for emergency protective measures, like putting in, like paying for the top overtime and stuff like that. Individual assistance is, of course, assistance to individuals. What people may remember as FEMA checks and whatnot. So FEMA does offer housing assistance, that's rental assistance, home repair assistance, direct temporary housing units, direct lease program, multifamily lease unit repair program, as well as other needs assistance for like medical costs, childcare, et cetera. And of course, like these are all just pretty much for households with low incomes, pretty inaccessible. It is exceptionally difficult to fill out that application, to prove to FEMA where you live, to do all that. And so typically, you see a lot of, so while this all sounds like excellent, it's typically so many obstacles have been erected that it prevents access to aid. And for people experiencing homelessness, they're pretty much just not eligible for any of that. So FEMA says officially that it will not offer housing assistance to individuals experiencing homelessness because their housing needs were not created by the disaster. However, they will provide types of other needs assistance, such as funeral assistance. So I always say, FEMA will pay to bury a person experiencing homelessness, but it will not pay to house a person experiencing homelessness.
That's sick.
And yeah, and so, and just to be clear, again, we're talking about people that were experiencing homelessness prior to the disaster. So people will also lose homes following a disaster and enter into homelessness based on some additional things. But because I had to extend out the presentation beyond just this, but because this is really the most horrible thing. And interestingly enough, that FEMA makes the distinction between people that it considers homeless and then people it considers residents of non-traditional housing, which would be like tents or huts or lean-tos. So if a resident of non-traditional housing can prove that they lived in a tent at a certain spot prior to the disaster and then were impacted by the disaster, they can get 2 months rental assistance.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Because how do you
Yeah, I know.
prove that you lived in a tent at a particular place? And what is rental assistance if you're living in a public space?
Yeah, no, yeah. So they're just exactly. That's what gets me up in the morning, guys.
Yeah.
Like, so
Just yes.
so exactly, it's just wholesale. And I've never seen an agency make this type of a distinction before as well. And yeah, it's pretty bad, but we can like ruminate on this for a little bit. Yeah.
I think this comes from a law enforcement led space, because oftentimes credible sources or private agencies, a lot of cities rely on certificates from law enforcement. So I feel like it has like a law enforcement mechanism built into it, and it's process for people who are not entitled to this.
Yeah, I mean, so she mentioned, I'm sorry, I didn't remember your name from Lily, mentioned that credible source is kind of a law enforcement term and has historically been used as a kind of way to kick out people out of a whatever, a process or a program. And I'd say that's exactly right. Number one, FEMA is housed within the Department of Homeland Security. Emergency management as a field grew out of the initial kind of civil defense, Cold War mindset. So, and I'm taking night classes for emergency management school, and man, it's all cops. And then there's me being like, hey, what about the, what about people that can't actually access that? And so, I think that's why it's so important that we as advocates are not only interfacing with the emergency management system and telling them in their jargon, what is going on, but that we're, we need to know about this stuff to attack it, because disasters will only continue to keep occurring in places that they have not occurred before.
Yes, and let's do one more question.
I-
Oh, no, Graham, please.
Well, I had two questions, so I don't want to.
Let's do two questions. from Graham.
The first one is, sort of goes back to the slide before this, but in thinking about emergency and disaster, in Seattle and many other cities, 10 years ago, they declared an emergency of homelessness, right? So that emergency was declared, and they actually put that to I believe, to FEMA to say this is a disaster as a rolling disaster. So should I agree about that?
I think this is great context, and it'd be hard, I think, to capture it in the summary. But if you come here, I think the audience, and thanks for bearing with us with the tech.
Sure. The question is that in cities like Seattle and many other cities on the West Coast, roughly 10 years ago, there was a mass declaration of an emergency of homelessness as sort of a long running disaster. How does that fit in now, in terms of actually translating that into a FEMA response?
So I'll say there's an emergency that's declared at the state level or whatnot. And then there's a Stafford Act declaration of disaster, which is totally different and is a state request to the president that, such and such FEMA programs be activated. FEMA will then, send planes to fly over the disaster area and evaluate the damage and then recommend to the president what programs to be approved. So sometimes people use the declaration of emergency, and sometimes they might use FEMA resources via FEMA as a subset of the Department of Homeland Security or something like that. But typically, when you're talking about individual assistance and things like that, there are internal controls within the Stafford Act that prevent those from being activated like that. But now that is not, to say that a president couldn't say, I'm going to declare a disaster anyways, and FEMA has to do what the president, wants. So it certainly doesn't preclude it, but if you told FEMA that, they'd be like, well, we don't have anything to do with that.
It has to be an official declaration of disaster.
Yeah.
Interesting. The other question I had was about the permanent addresses. Or about addresses where people have their addresses for people who are experiencing homelessness. I work with people who live in vehicles, and a lot of people have addresses actually established, but they're not in the areas where they're living because they have to establish them in other states. And I'm wondering how that applies here, how they would even fit in this. I don't know. It's kind of a big question, but
yeah, no, so there's kind of two levels to that. If you're you have to show occupancy and ownership to FEMA. So you would need some sort of rent receipt or a lease or something from that other address to be oh, well, it's in the disaster area and, and I live there, that's my primary residence. And then FEMA would evaluate the damage to that property and then provide, a fraction of the assistance to repair. So, and that's essentially if you're not, that's just fraud at that point, which, isn't to say that that's, FEMA is, all of these rules and regulations are solely based on FEMA's preoccupation that somehow they might give somebody assistance that they didn't need. Meanwhile, that the vast majority of fraud that occurs following a disaster, contractor fraud or both federal level contractor fraud and, the easiest way to fraudulently get money in a disaster would probably be to start a contracting company and then apply for government funds. As opposed to a person that's just, suffering from a disaster. And you bring up a good point in that, in Puerto Rico, for instance, there's not a formal system of property title documentation. They utilize I said it was like, oh, Spanish colonial law, and somebody from Puerto Rico was like, that's not what it was. But they utilize, I guess, a codified kind of common law handshake type, land ownership. So it's everybody will have like the same address living on a hill, for instance. And so FEMA ended up denying 77,000 people following Hurricane Maria for assistance based on their inability to show that they own their own homes. And so, and we worked with people in Puerto Rico, with advocates at Legal Puerto Rico, to spread around an airship affidavit document that we were able to get FEMA to accept, but FEMA to this day won't actually share that affidavit with disaster survivors in Puerto Rico. They have to be shown it by, legal aid folks that exists, and generally only on appeal and that sort of thing, because they're worried about people using the affidavit instead of actually submitting like title documentation if they have, if that it's hitting the easy button. Somebody from the White House said the other day.
I just want to point out, we've got just under 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that we can transition to Evlonodo. And I think what you just said actually is a great transition point. Evlonodo has done some reporting on disaster readiness in Puerto Rico as it relates to their power grid. And, that is a story that has not really been told, and climate reporting is utterly failing in this country. And so I'd like to turn it over to Evlonodo to talk with us about his work in the media and climate reporting.
Hi, everyone. My discussion will briefly touch on, as Tristia mentioned, how and why news media must do a better job of covering climate change and environmental justice, and how good climate reporting can galvanize the public towards addressing many of the challenges and solutions we've discussed here today. So I want you to conjure a number in your mind, and that number is 1%. 1%. In 2021, climate change comprised only 1% of overall coverage on broadcast nightly and Sunday morning news shows. The good news, at nearly 22 hours of reporting, broadcast TV news coverage of climate change actually tripled from 2020 to 2021. It still only accounted for 1% of climate coverage. Pardon me. When it comes to environmental justice, corporate broadcast news shows only aired 19 environmental justice segments in 2021. In addition to the sheer lack of climate and environmental coverage, the substance of the climate coverage is consistently lacking. This distinct failure to include vital context for news audiences also, in no small part, hides the true scale of climate and environmental injustices, because it silos them away from the public's broader understanding of the policies that materially harm socially marginalized communities every single day. So even when the news media deigns to cover a climate or environmental justice story at all, it too often lacks accountability for the industries and policies that are polluting our air, land, and water, that are driving marginalized communities to make it harder for them to recover after disasters, not natural disasters, after disasters, and the public officials who look away. The lack of substance is driven by news outlets failing to consistently connect climate change to extreme weather events, failing to contextualize the disproportionate harm that climate change and environmental injustice have on socially marginalized communities, specifically due to systemic inequities and injustices, failing to treat the climate crisis and environmental injustice as an urgent issue with, importantly, political solutions, and failing to include the voices and expertise of those on the front lines of the climate crisis. This includes people of color, women, climate scientists, and climate journalists, among many others. And so I'll pick up a little bit, because I know we want to have a few time for some questions. So how news outlets can improve their coverage of climate change and environmental justice. Going forward, they must commit to a shared, sustained, and substantive reporting that engages the public, eschews disinformation, and details the potential solutions that can mitigate climate change's worst consequences. You can do this by reporting on the ways climate change intersects with people's everyday lives, connecting extreme weather events to the science of climate change, connecting climate and environmental consequences to political and corporate policies and practices that exacerbate impacts and hamper recoveries, and contextualizing the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental consequences by reporting on the systemic inequalities and injustices that shape them, and amplifying the voices of those on the front lines of the climate crisis and environmental injustice. The good news is that good climate reporting can disrupt public apathy, frustration, and cynicism about the efficacy of climate action. A study from the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives found that media coverage of climate change can either lead citizens to climate cynicism or help them build a more positive public engagement. A study titled News Media and Climate Politics found that the primary barriers to public engagement with climate change are not scientific illiteracy or a lack of information. And so the problem lies in how so many people perceive and understand themselves as profoundly alienated from political structures and institutions that appear to govern our collective response to the problem. It's something that the media practices, whether it's aware of it or not. So good climate reporting counters manufactured scientific controversies, highlights paths to political engagement and efficacy, celebrates political action, highlights political successes, localizes political scale, normalizes political engagement, and concretizes political action. With that, I'm happy to take questions, and I look forward to our coming discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Evlonodo. Some questions. So, I know that climate reporting is lacking, and that's in the context of a lot of changes in reporting generally. So, corporatized media maybe is always, a constant, but something that is changing is the way that people consume media. So as people move away from traditional print mediums and to their phones and start ingesting and consuming media in different formats, and the clickbait nature of media profit drives storytelling, are we in a position to where we can influence climate reporting, or do we have to go outside of traditional media, use social media and other mechanisms for telling the truth about the issues that affect us?
That's a great question. I think it's twofold. If you look at the recent midterms, climate change was definitely top of voters' minds. It drove what many are saying was historic turnout among Generation Z. And a lot of the organizing was done on social media channels such as TikTok. Whereas the traditional news media completely missed that story. It had a kind of a singular focus on other important issues, but it kind of missed climate as a driving force among voters. So I think people are going to continue to organize at the ground level, at the state, regional level around climate. And I think the more that they can subvert these traditional news channels, the more successful they will be. I think the problem why my organization focuses on traditional news, in addition to social media, is that a lot of the policymakers still get their news from these kind of corporate / mainstream news sources. But I think it's being upended, like you said, because the more people do the work on the ground, the more people are seeing success in their organizing, the more that the mainstream media will have to pay attention to the work they're doing. But we still call upon them to do a better job of covering the issue, of using their expansive lens and resources to do a better job of covering what's happening in many of these communities.
So one of the issues regarding, better coverage is framing of people's readiness and their response to warnings about disaster. So, one of the things that we know is when there's a hurricane coming, and we just saw this play out, and we'll see it play out again. There's a discussion of, why didn't people leave? Why did they make the choice to stay? And there are stories that focus on people, what in kind of a postmortem analysis looks like a poor individual choice to stay. There isn't discussion about lack of ability to evacuate. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and how we can reframe that in traditional media.
Yeah, that's critical, especially in my recent work. I have Say Poor People Challenge, broadcasters Say Poor People Challenge, or working class, because you're right, a lot of people don't have the resources to evacuate. A lot of working people don't have the resources. And so what happens is, or what my fear is that the media weirdly pathologizes people that lack the resources to either evacuate or rebuild. They're kind of siloed off into just being poor, unfortunate people. You know, we talk about the natural disaster idea, you know, it's just an act of God. I agree with that. That's what I try to incorporate in my work, because it's not an act of God. These are concrete political and policy decisions that have created an environment where some people are disproportionately harmed over and over again by storms. And I think what we try to do in my work is we try to push the media to recognize that it's not a very simple story of, you know, choice, that you're dealing with long-term systemic inequalities that have created the conditions where some people can't evacuate, some people can't recover. And now there's conversation about who can even live in some of these areas that are experiencing sea level rise and will experience more extreme weather changes, which gets into the climate migration issue. So I hope that kind of addresses your question.
Thank you. And, you know, sort of relatedly, when we talk about, you know, changing how media reports on certain issues, I mean, climate change is driven by, you know, primarily by two industries, the fossil fuel industry and big agriculture. Yes. You know, I'm not a climate scientist. You don't need to be a climate scientist to know that. There are two industries that need to be called out when we do reporting on disaster and when we do reporting on the changing climate. Do you, as a journalist, see any change in how we report and hold those two industries accountable for the threat that they pose to our communities now and to all human life in a short period of time?
No, to me, the biggest piece that is lacking outside of reporting on vulnerable communities is the accountability piece. You know, because every now and then you will get an environmental justice story that talks about a city that's dealing with lead in their water or a Superfund site, but that's almost 100% of the time disconnected from the actual entity that is responsible for polluting the water or air. When we talk about climate change in general, it is almost wholly, except for a few instances, I mean, you can't, but 90% of the time, it is the climate change, extreme weather reporting. It's never connected to the industries that are driving most of the climate change. And, you know, we're calling for that, we're pushing for that. In addition to the flip side, where we say it's not just blaming the fossil fuel industry, who rightly deserve blame for driving it, but there is an alternative path that we can take. The window is closing rapidly, but we have to hold the industry accountable and begin to transition to a cleaner, more sustainable way of generating our energy needs. So, but it is a very uphill battle to climb because it's such a powerful, well-resourced industry, and they've spent 30 years and billions of dollars, you know, promoting climate skepticism and the benefits of fossil fuels. So it's definitely an uphill battle to climb.
Thank you. Do we have any audience questions? We've got a little bit of time for audience questions of Evlonodo or our other panelists. Yes.
I have a question. Hi, I'm Andrew Christian. I'm the new research director at Southern Poverty Law Center. And something that when I feel like sometimes when we talk about environmentalism or climate change, people's eyes glaze over and they say, well, that's, you know, a white person's issue. That's not something that addresses us both as a racial justice issue. So within your work, how do you get that messaging across? Do you focus on the housing specifically? Do you focus on the job specifically rather than framing it as climate change, environmental justice, the racial justice issue? Because that's something that from a research stance, I really want to understand on how to frame and message that so people really understand the importance of this to communities of color.
So I think that's a great question to each of our panelists. We have a set of panelists that come from a social science perspective, from a legal perspective, from the media, and I'm hoping that each of you can address that. And let's start with our virtual panelists. Evlonodo, you can kick us off.
Oh, I think the question was how do we incorporate racial justice in our work of climate and environmental reporting?
That's right.
Yeah, one thing that I'm doing is I took on a specific focus on environmental justice. You know, like you said, climate change is a very broad topic. part of what I want to do is dig in more into the actual material ramifications on the ground for vulnerable communities. Speaking about lead, speaking about air pollution, speaking about water pollution and contamination. So I think just being very deliberate and connecting the idea that it could be a community in Virginia or in the Midwest or an urban community, but the impacts are felt across the country. You know, it starts here. It usually starts in the Black and brown communities, but the sickness and the disease usually spread to other communities. None of us will be immune from the environmental impacts of pollution or the weather impacts from climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sean, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so I guess being a scientist is my thinking is always to kind of try and pull on data that highlights these disparate impacts and bring it to the attention of decision makers. I'm less familiar with the US, but I know in Canada, when I speak to senior policymakers and government officials, they'll kind of be interested in these issues writ large, but really not understand or be aware of the equity implications and the health disparities. We've got a foothold in Canada in terms of acknowledgement of the genocide of our Indigenous populations. And I think there are disproportionate impacts, and I think there are mechanisms and there's some momentum there. So I think we can build on that momentum to then expand it out to look at other racialized communities who are disproportionately impacted and try and plug into some of that political momentum. And we have a government right now that's fairly receptive to that. We'll see where we're at in years to come, but that's where I would go.
Thank you. And Noah.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, so we do this all the time, fighting with FEMA about sharing information with research institutions and things like that, because right now there's no actual way to access that kind of information in terms in the United States in terms of what happens to people following a disaster long term. Because of course FEMA won't release that information because of course it'll be very bad for FEMA. So, you know, number one, I think there needs to be disaster recovery research, and that's a field that's just, I think, getting started. And number two, I'd say I don't think that there is currently a synthesized way to talk about environmental justice, racial justice, housing justice, and disaster recovery justice in the same way, because I think all those fields have been going. And it'll be like, because I'll see like sometimes in like a climate journal or somebody will be like, well, disasters are like real bad, like, or you know, and it's like, yeah, man, like what do you think we're doing? Like, so I think there needs to be some sort of synthesis, and I don't know if it's like a convention or like a statement or like something that might be useful to bring those together. But yeah, if you do it, something on a call.
I was trying to look for a person's name and I can't find her name now, but she works at the Gulf on the Green New Deal, the Gulf Coast Policy Center. What's her name?
Gulf Coast Center alone.
Yeah, Gulf Coast Center alone. But you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, they're like Taproot now.
Yeah, are they? Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I work with like a lot of like different groups that I felt did this well, especially like within like Black communities. And like, for example, I was just somewhere the other day and there was a group from Louisiana and their community was right next to a river that had a power plant on it. And it was a bunch of elders from that community that had come together. They literally like gone to Washington and like lobby people. I think that if you're like, I think like on like a national scale, I think it gets complicated because I think the issue becomes more important to the people that are experiencing the issue. And so like, for me, it's always a racial issue because when I'm working in community, everybody that I'm working with is Black and brown and they're absolutely being affected by climate change. So it's not like hard for me to tell them that this is also a disability rights issue, it's a housing issue, it's a climate issue, because my focus like stays on them. So I don't know, it's like an unhelpful answer to.
No, it's very helpful.
Okay, I was like, I don't know about answering it. But I think like when you're trying to like extrapolate and you're trying to make it bigger and you focus on the issue, or like now I'm an issue person, you automatically kind of like abstract the person away. And that's what we do a lot of the time when we come to issue based. But I work with a lot of people that live at the intersection of a lot of these siloed things. And so I just refuse to silo. Am I a disability rights attorney? Yeah, because I'll write in the ADA, in my eviction, in my, you know what I mean? I'll put climate gentrification, I'll put all the things. If it's hurting you, I become an expert. And I won't silo, and I'll take all your information. And if you don't understand, then I'll explain it to the powers that be. So I think it's like a little bit of like refusing to separate them when you're doing your advocacy. And just because everyone else is trying to separate it, who cares? It's all made up anyways. I'll make up my own thing. It's all fake. And it's not helping people. So when things aren't helping, I feel very like justified and like trying to burn it down or tell people that I'm just not gonna listen. And I think like I learned that from a lot of the community members that I work with, to be 100% honest. Like when I work with them, I'm like, oh, it doesn't work this way. They're like, why? No. I'm like, okay, so we're just gonna do this then, even though that's like not supposed to happen. But yeah, I think just, and for me, I guess I'll have a concrete, it's just like constantly mentioning in the advocacy sort of what's happening. So I primarily work on housing, but I don't let it slip at like a public hearing or to the commissioners or like when I'm talking, that it's also a disability rights issue, that it's also a climate gentrification issue, that it's also all those things. So you just see me as a housing advocate, but I'm also constantly always bringing in all these other things into it to make sure that whenever someone hears me speak and they see me as housing, I'm also saying all these other things as well, because it's that too. But yeah.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause for our great panel. And for everyone tracking CLE credits, our second word is reform. So that's relief and reform. Thank you very much for coming to climate change and homelessness. Really appreciate the presence today. Thank y'all.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
I'm so naive sometimes on my job.
Did you just say you sound naive? You do not sound naive. What are your